When we think of the horrors of slavery in the antebellum South, the stories that often come to mind focus on the brutality inflicted by white male slave owners. Whips, chains, and public punishments dominate the historical imagination, shaping the collective understanding of a system designed to oppress and dehumanize. Yet beneath these familiar narratives lies a much less discussed, deeply unsettling reality: the active role that white women played in enforcing cruelty, humiliation, and exploitation upon black male slaves. This is not a story of passive complicity or benign neglect. It is a story of calculated actions and decisions made within the private walls of households and plantations, where power dynamics allowed women to wield authority over the lives of those enslaved, while societal norms limited their public power. Inside their homes, these women exercised significant control, deciding who would work, who would be punished, and how obedience was enforced. In this shadowed space, the experiences of black male slaves were shaped not just by the visible presence of patriarchal violence, but also by the invisible, psychological, and sometimes physical authority of the women around them. Imagine the day-to-day existence of a young black man on a southern plantation. His labor is relentless, his movements constantly monitored, and his dignity systematically stripped away. The overseer may set the pace, but it is often the mistress of the house who dictates the finer details: whether a task has been done properly, how punishment is administered, or even how he might be subjected to forms of humiliation that leave lasting emotional scars. The power these women held could turn ordinary chores into exercises in fear, shaping every aspect of the lives of those they oversaw. Historical accounts reveal shocking examples of this hidden cruelty. Black male slaves were subjected to harsh physical discipline, overwork, and forms of emotional manipulation that left deep psychological wounds. Some narratives detail the subtle yet devastating ways in which obedience and compliance were enforced, where a glance, a word, or a sudden act could determine a man's fate for the day. Beyond the physical, there was also the tragic reality of sexual exploitation, a topic seldom discussed openly, but well documented in historical records and slave narratives. These abuses were not mere lapses in morality, they were exercises of power, rooted in a system that saw enslaved men as property rather than human beings. By uncovering these hidden layers of oppression, we begin to understand the complexity of slavery's cruelty, the different ways power was wielded, and the profound suffering endured by black men at the hands of white women. These stories have often been silenced, overlooked, or sanitized in mainstream history, but they are essential to a fuller understanding of the past. If this opening resonates with you, please consider supporting the channel. Hit the like button, share this video with friends and family, and subscribe so you never miss future explorations into history's untold truths. Together, we can bring light to the stories that have long been hidden and honor the resilience of those who endured unimaginable hardship. As the antebellum South unfolded in all its brutal complexity, the daily life of a black male slave was a harrowing existence, one that tested the limits of endurance, resilience, and spirit. While history has often highlighted the cruelty of male slaveholders, the hidden power wielded by white women over these men was both insidious and profound, shaping a reality that was rarely spoken of outside the plantation walls. Within the confines of grand homes and sprawling estates, these women exercised authority in ways that could be both overt and subtle, and their actions left deep scars, physical, emotional, and psychological, that endured long after emancipation. For many enslaved men, labor was only the beginning of the daily trials. They rose before dawn to tend fields or perform household duties, their bodies pressed to the limits by the relentless demands of the plantation. Mistakes or slow progress could invoke harsh repercussions. Yet it was not only the overseer or the master who decided their fate. The mistress of the house, often seen by society as gentle, refined, or constrained by the expectations of femininity, held a quiet yet formidable power. Her presence alone could command obedience, and her decisions could inflict punishment designed to assert control. Maintain hierarchy, and remind the enslaved of their supposed place in the social order. Accounts from the period reveal the astonishing severity with which some white women treated black men under their authority. Floggings, beatings, and whippings were not uncommon. Sometimes, these acts were administered personally, other times ordered with a casual air of authority that spoke volumes about the normalized cruelty within the household. But physical punishment was only part of the story. Some men were subjected to mutilation, a terrifying form of discipline meant to leave an enduring mark of domination. Fingers broken, limbs scarred, and other forms of violence served as grim reminders that resistance, real or imagined, could be met with unthinkable consequences. These acts were rarely impulsive or isolated. They were carefully calibrated displays of power, designed to reinforce the social and racial hierarchies that slavery depended upon. Beyond outright violence, the exploitation of labor became a vehicle for both control and suffering. Men were often pushed beyond human limits, required to work from the first light of morning until long after sunset. Their strength tested and their endurance exhausted. The mistress might demand perfection, punishing the slightest lapse or perceived laziness. And in some cases, men were forced to continue labor despite injury, illness, or extreme fatigue. This relentless overwork was not simply a reflection of greed. It was a mechanism of psychological domination. By demonstrating that even the strongest could be broken through constant labor and relentless oversight, the enslaver maintained a pervasive atmosphere of fear and obedience. The abuse extended beyond what could be measured physically. Psychological torment was woven into the very structure of plantation life. The threat of punishment hung constantly in the air, but so too did subtle forms of intimidation. A glance, a sigh, or a pointed comment could carry the weight of authority, reshaping behavior and instilling a constant awareness of vulnerability. For many men, the unpredictability of punishment was a source of profound anxiety, for they never knew whether a small misstep or even an unintentional act could lead to humiliation, physical harm, or worse. Emotional manipulation worked in tandem with physical coercion, as enslaved men were systematically stripped of agency, their decisions constrained at every turn by the invisible hand of the women who commanded them. Some of the most disturbing accounts describe situations where enslaved men were isolated or singled out for particularly cruel treatment. They could be confined for long hours, forced to witness the punishment of others, or even compelled to participate in acts that degraded their own dignity. In the stories passed down through slave narratives and documented in court cases, one sees how fear, exhaustion, and constant surveillance coalesced into a form of psychological imprisonment that was as confining as any chain. For those who survived these ordeals, the effects were lasting, shaping identities and perspectives long after freedom was attained. Perhaps most chillingly, the abuse could extend into the intimate sphere, where power dynamics allowed white women to manipulate or exploit enslaved men in ways that blurred the lines between coercion and violation. The societal taboo surrounding such acts ensured that few accounts were openly discussed, leaving a silence in the historical record that obscured the depth of suffering. Yet where records do exist from personal testimonies, diaries, and court documents, they reveal the complex, often devastating, impact of these relationships. The control exerted was absolute, a reminder that the enslaved man's life, body, and autonomy were subject to the will of another, and that the exercise of power could take forms both visible and invisible, public and private. Through these layers of brutality, beatings, flogging, overwork, mutilation, and psychological manipulation, a pattern emerges. The systematic reinforcement of a hierarchy in which black men were rendered powerless. their humanity denied, and their suffering normalized. While history often highlights the visible displays of cruelty from male slaveholders, the role of white women in these dynamics was no less significant, no less harmful. Theirs was a power exercised within constrained social roles, yet it was fully capable of inflicting deep and enduring pain. It is in recognizing this hidden dimension that we gain a fuller understanding of the complexities of slavery, the multifaceted mechanisms of oppression, and the resilience of those who endured it. In the end, the stories of black male slaves under the authority of white women remind us that cruelty in the antebellum South was not monolithic, but layered, pervasive, and often hidden behind the veneer of gentility. Every whip, every overworked muscle, every subtle act of intimidation contributed to a system built on domination and dehumanization. It is a sobering reminder that the true history of slavery encompasses not only the well-known narratives of overt violence, but also the quieter, yet equally devastating, exercises of control that shaped lives, bodies, and spirits for generations. In the oppressive world of the antebellum South, the lives of enslaved black men were shaped by layers of control and domination that reached into every aspect of their existence, including the most personal and private corners of their lives. Among the most harrowing realities they faced was the coercion and exploitation at the hands of white women who wielded authority with a combination of social power, psychological influence, and intimate access that could be both terrifying and inescapable. While plantation narratives often emphasize the visible brutality inflicted by overseers and male slaveholders, there exists a darker, less spoken of dimension in which white women participated actively in the subjugation of enslaved men, asserting dominance in ways that were deeply invasive and traumatic, leaving scars that no labor or survival could erase. Within the walls of grand houses or in secluded areas of the estate, enslaved men were sometimes subjected to advances that carried the weight of coercion. These interactions were rarely consensual, framed instead by the imbalance of power that defined the social hierarchy of the time. A glance that lingered too long, a suggestion delivered with a subtle but firm insistence, or the threat of consequences for refusal could force men into situations where they had little choice, and where resistance risked punishment, humiliation, or reprisal. The very environment of slavery, where autonomy was systematically stripped away, made any act of refusal fraught with danger. Men were aware that disobedience could provoke beatings, overwork, or social ostracization, yet compliance often exacted a psychological toll that was invisible to the world outside the plantation. The coercion was not always physical. In many cases, it was rooted in manipulation and the strategic use of authority. White women, by virtue of their status, controlled access to resources, protection, and relative safety within the household, and these levers of power could be used to extract compliance in intimate ways. Men might be promised favors, protection, or relief from labor, only to discover that the true cost was the surrender of their bodily autonomy. The psychological landscape of such encounters was treacherous. A man could never be sure whether apparent kindness was genuine or merely a precursor to exploitation, and each interaction carried the dual weight of fear and moral compromise, leaving an enduring impact on one's sense of self. Accounts from diaries, court records, and oral histories reveal the profound complexity of these dynamics. In some instances, men were isolated, subtly separated from the watchful eyes of other enslaved workers or visitors, and placed in situations where the demands of a woman's authority could not be openly questioned. The fear of punishment was ever present, but so too was the internalized knowledge that resistance could bring both immediate harm and long-term repercussions, ranging from the intensification of labor to acts of humiliation designed to reinforce submission. In these contexts, power was exercised quietly but effectively, with each act of coercion reinforcing a broader system in which enslaved men were denied the most basic human dignity. Forced to navigate an environment where every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. The emotional and psychological ramifications of such coercion were staggering. Men lived under the constant tension between survival and resistance, their inner lives burdened by shame, anger, and fear that could not be safely expressed. The trauma was compounded by the secrecy imposed by societal norms. Discussions of such abuse were largely forbidden, and men had few avenues to seek support or understanding. The silences surrounding these experiences served to deepen the isolation, as men were left to grapple privately with experiences that were both deeply personal and profoundly violating. In this way, the abuse was not only a violation of the body but an assault on identity, autonomy, and the ability to trust oneself or others. In some narratives, the abuse extended into the manipulation of relationships within the enslaved community itself. Trust could be undermined, alliances strained, and social bonds tested as men navigated the unpredictable and perilous demands placed upon them. The very structures of plantation life, designed to fragment solidarity and maintain control, amplified the effects of intimate coercion, making the psychological landscape even more treacherous. Each encounter carried the weight of dual realities: the immediate need to survive and the enduring consequences that would linger in memory, shaping how men understood themselves, their worth, and their place in a society that systematically dehumanized them. Even in rare moments of perceived kindness or attention, the underlying context of power and coercion could not be ignored. A seemingly benevolent interaction often carried with it the implicit knowledge that boundaries were fragile, and that the slightest misstep could trigger consequences that were severe and unpredictable. The awareness that one's body could be claimed without consent, that refusal was fraught with peril, and that societal structures offered no protection created a pervasive climate of anxiety and hypervigilance. Over time, these experiences left marks that transcended the physical, embedding themselves deeply into the consciousness and shaping the psychological reality of those who endured them. Through this lens, the narratives of black male slaves reveal an unsettling truth. The exercise of power by white women was multifaceted, encompassing not only the management of labor and household duties, but also intimate and coercive interactions that left enduring scars. The trauma endured was compounded by secrecy, social taboos, and the systemic denial of autonomy, creating a legacy of suffering that reached far beyond the immediate act of abuse. Understanding these experiences is crucial to a fuller comprehension of slavery's human cost, for it underscores how power was wielded in both visible and hidden ways, shaping lives in profound and often devastating ways that history has only begun to fully acknowledge. In recognizing the coercion and trauma inflicted by white women upon enslaved men, one gains insight into the complex and layered mechanisms of oppression that defined the antebellum South. It is a story of resilience in the face of relentless control, of survival within a system designed to dominate and dehumanize, and of the enduring impact of experiences that were as intimate as they were injurious, leaving an indelible imprint on both history and the human spirit. In the sprawling plantations of the antebellum South, where the weight of slavery hung over every waking moment, the cruelty that enslaved black men endured was not limited to the physical or even the deeply invasive acts of sexual coercion, but extended insidiously into the realm of emotional and psychological torment. White women, often perceived by history as passive figures confined to parlors and drawing rooms, wielded a form of power that was subtle, yet profoundly damaging, shaping the inner lives of those who labored under their control in ways that were both invisible and unforgettable. This manipulation and humiliation operated through a carefully maintained balance of unpredictability and attention, creating a world in which enslaved men were never entirely safe from scrutiny, criticism, or emotional exploitation. and where the boundaries of dignity and autonomy were constantly tested and often violated. In many households, the enslaved men were acutely aware that every interaction carried the potential for both reward and punishment, and that favor could be as fleeting and unpredictable as the moods of those in control. A gesture that might seem kind or encouraging could be withdrawn without warning, replaced by a glare, a sharp rebuke, or a cruel jest meant to remind the man of his subordinate position. Over time, these patterns of behavior created a pervasive climate of anxiety and hypervigilance, in which every word spoken, every glance exchanged, and every hesitation in action became an object of scrutiny. The very act of existing within the household demanded constant attention and adaptation, and any lapse, whether real or imagined, could invite scorn. Public embarrassment, or further emotional punishment. The unpredictability of treatment was itself a tool of control, teaching men that stability and peace were never guaranteed, and that survival required constant attunement to the whims and caprices of those who held authority. This emotional manipulation often intertwined with the broader structures of power and labor that defined the plantation. Men might be praised for diligence one moment and chastised for imagined slights the next, reinforcing a sense of insecurity and dependence that extended beyond the immediate encounter. Humiliation could be public, designed to erode self-esteem and assert dominance, or private, where whispered criticisms and insinuations undermined confidence and fostered a persistent fear of exposure. Even when physical punishment or coercion was absent, the psychological effects were profound, leaving men in a state of constant self-surveillance and doubt, questioning their actions, their intentions, and, in some cases, their own worth. The deliberate erosion of a person's sense of self was a form of power that operated silently but persistently, a mechanism of control that extended far beyond what could be measured by the infliction of visible harm. Accounts from memoirs, letters, and later oral histories provide glimpses into the profound stress and trauma produced by these dynamics. One man might describe the relentless anxiety of never knowing how a mistress of the house would react to even minor errors, while another recalls the sting of public ridicule or whispered insinuations that questioned his character, his loyalty, or his intelligence. The emotional labor required to navigate these interactions was exhausting, demanding vigilance, adaptability, and, often, the suppression of natural responses to anger, fear, or frustration. In such an environment, the very act of maintaining one's identity became a daily struggle, and the preservation of dignity required strategies of negotiation, endurance, and sometimes concealment that left deep, lasting marks on the psyche. Emotional torment was compounded when manipulation intersected with the systemic inequalities of plantation life. White women, by virtue of their social position, controlled not only access to comfort and privilege, but also to subtle forms of protection or sanction within the household hierarchy. A man who attempted to assert boundaries or resist unfair treatment might find himself isolated, denied basic considerations, or subjected to intensified scrutiny, while those who acquiesced were still left to grapple with the knowledge that their compliance did not guarantee safety or respect. The power to withhold approval, affection, or attention became a tool of domination that reached into the mind as well as the body, shaping behavior through fear, uncertainty, and the slow erosion of self-confidence. Over time, the psychological imprint of such treatment could be as damaging as any physical punishment, fostering internalized insecurity and a diminished sense of autonomy that persisted long after specific incidents had passed. Moreover, the emotional manipulation extended into the complex social relationships within the enslaved community itself. Men who endured ridicule or criticism in front of others often found that their peers were forced to navigate these dynamics as well, either by witnessing humiliation, offering silent support, or attempting to shield one another from scrutiny. Trust became fraught, alliances could be strained, and social cohesion was continuously tested as men sought to survive both the labor demands and the emotional complexities imposed by those in power. The interplay of private and public humiliation created a pervasive tension in which every interaction carried the potential to amplify feelings of vulnerability, isolation, or self-doubt, reinforcing the psychological grip that white women could exercise even without resorting to physical coercion. In reflecting on the emotional torment inflicted by white women, it becomes clear that the psychological dimensions of slavery were inseparable from its physical and sexual manifestations. The manipulation, unpredictability, and humiliation experienced by enslaved men functioned as mechanisms of control that operated on a deeply personal level, shaping self-perception, behavior, and the capacity to maintain a sense of autonomy in a system designed to deny both. Understanding this aspect of slavery is essential to grasping its full human cost, for it underscores the ways in which power and domination were exercised not only through visible violence but also through subtle, persistent, and deeply invasive psychological strategies. Ultimately, the legacy of emotional torment endured by enslaved black men illustrates a broader truth about the mechanisms of oppression. Control was multifaceted, and the exercise of authority could be as damaging in the mind as it was on the body. Through manipulation, humiliation, and unpredictable treatment, white women on plantations imposed a form of psychological subjugation that left enduring scars, challenging the very sense of self and autonomy of those who lived under their power, and revealing the profound and enduring human cost of slavery that extends beyond the visible and into the unseen recesses of memory and identity. On the vast plantations that stretched across the antebellum South, the institution of slavery was not merely a system of labor, but a carefully orchestrated mechanism of control in which human beings were stripped of their most fundamental rights and treated explicitly as property. Enslaved men were bought, sold, and transferred with little regard for the bonds of family or community. And the daily reality of life under such a system was one of constant uncertainty and fear. Fathers, husbands, and brothers could be ripped from their loved ones at any moment, leaving emotional devastation in their wake and severing the fragile networks of trust and intimacy that sustained enslaved communities. Each sale or forced relocation served as a chilling reminder that their existence was measured not in human dignity but in economic value, and the pervasive anxiety generated by such arbitrary cruelty became a form of psychological control as effective as any whip or lash. Within this framework, the deliberate fracturing of families was both a tool and a strategy. Plantation owners and their families, including white women who wielded authority within the household, understood that by severing familial bonds, they could weaken resistance and maintain dominance. Enslaved men who lived with the constant threat of losing their wives, children, or parents were compelled to navigate a life defined by loss, in which hope and security were fleeting illusions. Even when families remained physically intact, the knowledge that separation could occur at any time cast a shadow over daily existence, infusing ordinary routines with a sense of impending tragedy. The emotional toll of this uncertainty was profound, as men struggled to preserve connections and care for loved ones in the face of a system designed to deny them agency and continuity. Emotional suffering was further compounded by the mechanisms of psychological domination exercised by white women on the plantations. Beyond overseeing labor or enforcing household rules, they often engaged in behaviors intended to humiliate, manipulate, and undermine enslaved men, exploiting the very structures of slavery that allowed them to assert control. A man could be chastised for perceived insolence, mocked for his attempts at autonomy, or subtly manipulated to comply with demands that reinforced his subordinate status. And the cumulative effect of such treatment was a constant erosion of self-worth. This calculated imposition of psychological stress was a form of power that operated invisibly yet inexorably, shaping behavior and instilling a pervasive sense of helplessness that complemented the more overt forms of oppression. The experience of being treated as property extended into every facet of daily life. Enslaved men were denied the freedom to make basic choices about their work, living conditions, or personal relationships, and every aspect of their existence was subject to the judgment or whim of those in power. Labor was often grueling and relentless, designed not merely for productivity but to reinforce submission, and failure or hesitation could invite punishment, ridicule, or further manipulation. In this environment, survival required vigilance, adaptation, and the careful negotiation of both physical and emotional boundaries, as even minor acts of perceived disobedience could have cascading consequences for personal safety and social standing within the enslaved community. The system's brutality was magnified by the separation of families, which was particularly devastating for men who, despite their oppression, sought to maintain roles as fathers, husbands, and sons. The forced disbanding of households undermined not only immediate emotional bonds, but also long-term social structures within enslaved communities. Eroding traditions, support networks, and shared resilience. Fathers might never witness their children grow, husbands could be torn from their wives, and brothers could be sent to different plantations, leaving relationships fragmented and the sense of community precarious. This constant threat of separation ensured that loyalty and attachment were perpetually fragile, and the psychological weight of such vulnerability became a silent instrument of control, binding men to a system that denied both love and stability. Even in moments when families remained together, the knowledge that they were vulnerable to sale or relocation infused every interaction with tension. Men who sought to protect or nurture their loved ones did so under the ever-present specter of intervention from those who had legal authority over their lives, including white women who could manipulate, threaten, or cause to achieve compliance. The power to inflict emotional pain through the disruption of family bonds or the imposition of humiliation amplified the effects of labor exploitation, creating a multidimensional system of oppression that penetrated both body and mind. Enslaved men had to navigate not only the physical demands of work, but also the emotional hazards of a household in which their humanity could be questioned, undermined, or exploited at any moment. Historical accounts, letters, and oral histories reveal the profound and enduring impact of these practices. Men recounted the anguish of witnessing family members sold away, the despair of attempting to maintain relationships under impossible conditions, and the quiet torment of living under constant scrutiny and threat. These experiences underscore that the emotional suffering deliberately inflicted by those in power was as intentional as it was devastating, serving to enforce submission, diminish hope, and maintain the structural integrity of slavery. The manipulation of human bonds and the systematic denial of autonomy were not incidental but central to the institution, illustrating that the horrors of slavery extended far beyond labor exploitation or physical punishment into the intimate spheres of the heart and mind. Ultimately, the treatment of enslaved men as property, the deliberate fracturing of families, and the calculated imposition of emotional suffering reveal the depth and complexity of control within the system of slavery. These practices demonstrate that power was exercised through both visible and invisible means, shaping lives and identities in ways that endured long after the shackles were removed. The stories of those who endured such conditions illuminate the resilience of the human spirit, the tragic costs of oppression, and the multifaceted strategies of domination that white women, alongside others in positions of authority, deployed to enforce a world in which men were denied not only freedom, but the most basic protections of love, family, and selfhood. Across the antebellum South, the lived experiences of enslaved men are chronicled not only in the abstract statistics of slavery but in the vivid, harrowing accounts of those who endured its cruelty firsthand, and the historical records of individuals whose lives became emblematic of the system's brutality. Madame Laurie, a woman of considerable influence within her household, is remembered for the calculated severity with which she disciplined and controlled the men who labored under her authority. Her treatment, as documented in legal records and personal testimonies, reflected a pattern in which white women exercised power in ways that could be both public and intimate, employing physical punishment, humiliation, and manipulation as tools to assert dominance. The legacy of her actions endures in the written testimonies that survive, revealing the intersecting forces of gender, authority, and racial oppression that shaped everyday life on the plantation. Similarly, the tragic story of Celia, a young enslaved woman forced into an unimaginable life of exploitation, provides insight into the broader dynamics of abuse that ensnared not only women but men within the same environment. While Celia's ordeal is often recounted in the context of her own suffering, the events surrounding her existence illuminate the network of coercion and control that extended to men on the plantation, who witnessed, experienced, or were implicated in cycles of violence and intimidation. Legal proceedings, court testimonies, and contemporary newspaper accounts document the complex interplay of fear, authority, and desperation that defined the lives of enslaved individuals. And these narratives collectively demonstrate the pervasive climate of oppression that white women could and did enforce, often with impunity. Equally compelling are the recollections of former slaves, whose first-hand accounts offer an unflinching window into the psychological and physical dimensions of plantation life. Charles Bell, for instance, recounted the relentless discipline imposed by white women in positions of power, describing episodes in which men were subjected to harsh punishments for minor perceived infractions or even for asserting their own humanity. The intensity of these experiences, often carried out within the household where supervision was constant, left an indelible mark on his sense of self and on the collective memory of his community. Bell's narratives capture the ways in which authority was exercised subtly and overtly, blending caution with psychological pressure to ensure compliance and reinforce hierarchical structures. John Parker's memoirs provide another critical perspective, detailing the ways in which white women manipulated both labor and social relations to maintain dominance over enslaved men. His accounts emphasize that punishment was rarely random. It was a strategic application of power designed to undermine autonomy and instill fear, ranging from public humiliation to threats that leveraged both social position and legal status. Parker's stories underscore the intersection of vulnerability and control, illustrating how men navigated a world in which their bodies and emotions were constantly policed, and where resistance could provoke severe consequences. The persistence of memory in these narratives demonstrates how experiences of cruelty were not isolated incidents but integral to the systemic oppression of the era. Austin Stewart's testimony further enriches our understanding, recounting the duality of punishment and psychological torment that defined interactions with white women on the plantation. Stewart described moments when discipline was intertwined with manipulation, creating a landscape in which men were never fully secure in their social or emotional standing. The unpredictability of treatment, combined with the ever-present threat of physical retribution or forced labor, generated a state of constant vigilance, requiring enslaved men to continually assess the intentions of those wielding authority over them. Stewart's reflections illuminate the subtle mechanisms through which fear, compliance, and control were perpetuated, providing a nuanced understanding of the complex power dynamics at play. These documented examples collectively illustrate the depth and breadth of cruelty embedded within the institution of slavery, revealing a spectrum of experiences that spanned physical, emotional, and social dimensions. Each story, whether drawn from legal records, memoirs, or oral histories, demonstrates that abuse was both intentional and systemic, carefully calibrated to maintain the structures of power that advantaged white women alongside the broader hierarchy of the plantation. The narratives of Madame Laurie, Celia, Charles Bell, John Parker, and Austin Stewart converge to depict a world in which human dignity was persistently undermined, and where resilience and survival demanded extraordinary courage, ingenuity, and endurance. In recounting these experiences, it becomes evident that the agency exercised by white women in enforcing oppression was multifaceted, often blending overt acts of punishment with subtle forms of psychological manipulation. The testimonies preserved through history highlight the constant negotiation and tension that defined the lives of enslaved men, revealing a reality in which the consequences of perceived disobedience or assertion of autonomy could be immediate, severe, and enduring. By weaving together these accounts, one gains a fuller understanding of the systemic cruelty that underpinned plantation life, the resilience required to endure it, and the enduring legacy of these experiences on subsequent generations. Ultimately, the documented cases of abuse and control serve not only as evidence of individual cruelty, but as powerful illustrations of the broader mechanisms by which slavery functioned to dominate and dehumanize. Through the narratives of Madame Laurie, Celia, and the first-hand accounts of former slaves like Charles Bell, John Parker, and Austin Stewart, the reader witnesses the calculated and multifaceted nature of oppression, and the extraordinary endurance of those who lived through it. These stories form an essential part of the historical record, providing both a cautionary reminder of the human capacity for cruelty and a testament to the resilience and survival of those who endured one of history's most brutal systems. Within the rigid hierarchies of the antebellum South, the exercise of power by white women over enslaved men reveals a deeply complex and often contradictory dynamic, in which authority, desire, and social constraint intertwined in ways that were both calculated and unpredictable. On the surface, these women were often confined by societal expectations, restricted from the political, economic, and legal avenues available to white men. Yet within the plantation household and its immediate sphere of influence, they could wield extraordinary control over those enslaved beneath them. This control frequently manifested in acts of sexual exploitation, not merely as an expression of personal desire but as a deliberate assertion of power, a mechanism through which women could enact dominance in a world that otherwise limited their agency. The tension inherent in this dynamic illustrates that oppression under slavery was never singular or simple. It was a layered system in which societal marginalization and personal authority could coexist, and in which the exercise of one's limited power often came at the expense of another's fundamental humanity. Enslaved men, already subject to the physical rigors and psychological demands of forced labor, found themselves navigating a social terrain fraught with peril and contradiction. The sexual coercion imposed by some white women was frequently cloaked in a veneer of domestic authority, reinforcing the hierarchical structures that governed every interaction. Threats, manipulations, and overt force were tools deployed to ensure compliance, and refusal could provoke severe punishment. Social ostracization, or intensified labor. Historical accounts make clear that these encounters were rarely isolated incidents. They were part of an environment in which the boundaries of consent and autonomy were systematically violated. The acts themselves were deeply entwined with the broader system of enslavement, in which human beings were commodified, and the assertion of dominance, whether physical, emotional, or sexual, served as a reminder that the enslaved occupied the lowest tier of social and legal recognition. The narratives preserved in the testimonies of former slaves reveal the profound and enduring psychological impact of these dynamics. Men like Charles Bell, John Parker, and Austin Stewart recounted episodes in which white women, often exercising the authority of a household overseer or matriarch, leveraged sexual coercion to maintain control over daily life, to enforce obedience, or to affirm their own social power in ways that extended beyond mere physical punishment. The trauma inflicted was multidimensional. It encompassed fear, shame, humiliation, and a profound sense of helplessness. Yet it also demanded constant vigilance, calculation, and the capacity to survive within an environment where every action was observed, judged, and potentially punished. In these narratives, one sees that sexual exploitation was not simply a matter of individual pathology, but a strategic instrument within a broader system designed to maintain the social and economic order of slavery. Moreover, the motivations behind such acts of exploitation were often complex, reflecting a blend of personal insecurity, desire for control, and adaptation to the constraints of a patriarchal society that simultaneously empowered and limited white women. The exertion of sexual authority over enslaved men could serve as compensation for the lack of societal agency, offering a domain in which women could exercise dominance without challenge. It was a power exercised with intent, sometimes subtle and sometimes overt, but always situated within a broader matrix of oppression that defined relationships across race, gender, and class. In this way, the plantation environment becomes a lens through which one can observe the intersectional nature of power. White women, while constrained by societal norms, could nevertheless perpetuate brutality, leveraging the vulnerabilities of enslaved men to assert their own position, and in doing so, reinforce the hierarchical structure that undergirded the institution of slavery. The historical record, replete with legal documents, personal testimonies, and contemporary accounts, underscores the deliberate and strategic nature of these actions. Madame Laurie, for instance, exercised her authority in ways that extended beyond physical labor management into the intimate and psychological spheres, demonstrating how power was intertwined with personal assertion and the enforcement of social hierarchies. Similarly, the experiences of men like Parker and Stewart reveal that sexual coercion was not merely an isolated tool of dominance, but part of a continuum of control that encompassed physical punishment, emotional manipulation, and relentless surveillance. In each, the interplay between societal constraint and personal agency shaped the form and impact of abuse, highlighting the ways in which power could be exercised in diverse and sometimes paradoxical ways within the plantation household. Yet within this landscape of control, the human capacity for resilience and endurance emerges as a recurring theme. Despite the trauma inflicted, enslaved found ways to survive, to retain a sense of self, and to navigate the unpredictable and often dangerous currents of power and desire that defined their lives. Their testimonies serve as both historical evidence and moral witness, revealing the human cost of a system designed to exploit every facet of their existence. The complexity of sexual exploitation in this context reflects not only the cruelty of individual actors, but the broader structural mechanisms through which slavery maintained social and economic dominance, and the ways in which those with limited societal agency could nonetheless exercise profound control over the lives of others. In connecting these accounts, one sees that the sexual exploitation imposed by white women on enslaved men was more than a series of individual transgressions. It was an integral part of a larger system in which power, fear, and survival were in constant tension. Through deliberate acts of coercion and manipulation, women who were themselves circumscribed by societal norms enacted authority in ways that reinforced the hierarchy of the plantation, leaving a legacy of trauma and testament that endures in the historical record. The stories of Madame Laurie, Parker, Stewart, and others illustrate the intricate and often painful intersection of gender, race, and power, highlighting the enduring consequences of a system in which human lives were subordinated to the imperatives of dominance, control, and survival. As we reach the closing of this exploration into a largely overlooked chapter of history, it becomes painfully clear that the sexual, physical, and emotional abuse endured by black male slaves at the hands of white women was not a peripheral issue, but a deeply entrenched element of the oppressive system that defined the antebellum South. While textbooks and mainstream narratives have often focused on the brutality of male overseers or the economic mechanics of slavery, the intimate and personal cruelty exercised by women within the households has been consistently marginalized, leaving generations of trauma unspoken and unacknowledged. Each story we have recounted, whether drawn from legal cases, slave testimonies, or historical records, serves as a testament to the resilience and humanity of those who lived through unimaginable suffering. Men like Charles Bell, John Parker, Austin Stewart, and countless others bore witness to experiences that were simultaneously physical, psychological, and sexual. And the legacies of these traumas have reverberated through families, communities, and collective memory ever since. Understanding the depth of this abuse requires us to confront the complex dynamics of power, control, and societal norms that shape the lives of both the oppressors and the oppressed. White women, though themselves restricted by societal limitations in the broader public sphere, wielded considerable authority within the plantation household, and this authority was often expressed in ways that caused deep and lasting harm. Sexual coercion, violent punishment, and emotional manipulation were employed not merely as expressions of personal cruelty, but as calculated mechanisms to reinforce dominance and maintain the hierarchies of slavery. This is not a story of isolated acts, but of a systematic reality in which the humanity of enslaved men was denied, their bodies commodified, and their spirits subjected to relentless assault. Families were torn apart, relationships destabilized, and the psychological weight of this oppression shaped lives in ways that were profound and enduring. By shining a light on these silenced narratives, we honor the resilience of those who endured such horrors and ensure that their suffering is neither forgotten nor dismissed. Recognition is essential not only for historical accuracy but also for understanding how trauma operates across generations, affecting descendants in ways that are often invisible yet deeply felt. The act of recounting these experiences is an act of remembrance and of resistance against the erasure of truth. It is a call to acknowledge that history is multifaceted, that suffering was experienced on many levels, and that the courage required to survive was immense. As difficult as these stories are to confront, they also provide a powerful lesson about the human capacity for endurance and the importance of bearing witness. The testimonies we have explored reveal the inner lives of men who navigated daily dangers with extraordinary resilience, demonstrating not only the cost of systemic oppression but also the strength inherent in survival. These narratives remind us that history is not simply a series of dates and events, but a tapestry woven from the lives, struggles, and resilience of individuals whose experiences too often went unrecorded. By engaging with these stories, we contribute to a fuller understanding of the past and affirm the necessity of confronting uncomfortable truths in order to prevent the repetition of similar injustices in the future. To our viewers, Thank you for taking the time to engage with this difficult yet essential history. Your willingness to learn, reflect, and remember is part of the process of honoring those whose voices were long silenced. If this video has provided insight, challenged your perspectives, or deepened your understanding, please consider supporting the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing this content so that more people can encounter these important narratives. By amplifying these stories, we help ensure that the lessons of history are not forgotten, and that the legacies of those who suffered under slavery are finally acknowledged and remembered with the dignity they deserve. Together, we can continue to uncover hidden histories, confront uncomfortable truths, and foster a culture of awareness and empathy that transcends generations. The story of the abuse endured by black male slaves at the hands of white women is a vital part of this endeavor, reminding us that the fight for historical recognition, justice, and remembrance is ongoing. Every act of learning, sharing, and reflecting contributes to preserving these narratives, giving voice to those who were denied it for centuries, and ensuring that the shadows of the past inform a more conscious and compassionate future. Thank you for joining us in this journey, and do not forget to like, subscribe, and share so that the stories that were once silenced can finally be heard and remembered.